All right, welcome everyone to our panel on leveraging generative AI and large language models. My name is Laurent Dombe. I'm the Chief Technologist for our worldwide federal financial services at Amazon Web Services. And I'll be your moderator for this session today. So, as you've heard in the previous sessions, the advancements in generative AI and large language models have the potential to ultimately transform and reshape the financial services industry. But when we're looking at the financial services industry and their implementation and where they are in the journey of large language models and generative AI, there's also some unique set of challenges that we see in the industry. And these are, how do you implement these solutions in an ethical and a transparent way, but at the same time also create business impact and value? And so to dive into these questions today, I'm thrilled to have two leaders next to me here that have been on the forefront in leveraging large language models and generative AI in their respective organizations and implementations. So please help me to welcome Karen Picariello. She's Head of Generative AI Strategy and Execution at Morgan Stanley Wealth Management, and Prem Natarajan, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Scientist at Capital One, where he heads up enterprise AI. So Prem, Karen, thank you so much for joining us and being here today. I'm very excited to start diving into your experiences and insights in regards to how our global financial services institutions are ultimately leveraging and using large language models.
Thanks, glad to be here.
All right, so let's get started. To level set, because no panel did this, so we're going to add this question, is what are large language models and what are they not? Corinne, you want to go first?
Maybe we can start with what they're not, right? And I think I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know, but they're not an inherently predictive tool, right? When we think about large language models, and particularly the way we think about them and using them at Morgan Stanley, we're focused on models that have been trained on human language based on the vastness of the internet, and therefore have the ability to generate something net new, right? And that component of new content generation is really the inflection point in terms of what's now available to us and humanity in terms of using artificial intelligence.
Maybe I'll continue the same thing and say, because of this audience that cares about models in a particular way, one thing they don't do is produce quantitative estimates of anything unless you do really strange things to them and force them to produce bad quantitative estimates of things. They're good at generating artifacts, things that we typically associate with the creative process. And so that's why they have kind of this cognitive feeling to them.
Perfect. So, like as you both said, when we're thinking about large language models, it's really about predicting text or from that perspective, but really not decision engines, as sometimes we conflate. Now, when we're thinking about large language models or models in general, data is very important. And Prem, when we're looking at Capital One has been relying on data for almost, or since its inception, where its founders pretty much came up, right, with the idea of using statistical analysis to create customized credit card offerings for different segments. And so now we're here today, and we're even more relying on data. And so in the realm of data integrity, can you a little bit speak about how you're looking at model governance and freshness at Capital One, the diversity of data and making sure that the data is not biased, and how basically you have the processes in place in regards to those data sets?
Yeah, I mean, you ended up by saying how data is not biased, but that's not where it all ends because the models don't have to not be biased, but even if the data is that way. But going right back, as you alluded to, Capital One's founding was based on using data for analytics to expand access to credit to folks who weren't necessarily served by the traditional sources that were used at that time. And so there's been a tremendous kind of almost reverence for data, and that's kind of become part of the culture. It started off with, in the 90s, everybody was in love, I think, with logistic regression, and so people used that. I moved on to somewhat more sophisticated statistical machine learning techniques. Over time, the progression has gone on to neural networks and things like that that are good at producing probabilistic estimates. And now we're at this place where we like to think about the LLMs as if they are the technology, but the underlying technology is really a particular type of neural network that people have named the transformer. It kind of evokes a strange kind of thing, but it's just a neural network. The distinctive characteristic of this is that it can consume massive amounts of data and make sense of the patterns that it sees in those massive amounts of data. And most of the time, those patterns, because it's being trained on text data, those patterns are about how humans express themselves, and which is what we associate with creativity. Turns out that that same technology can also be leveraged, the transformers, for non-text data or non-image data, where you're using all of, and if you have large amounts of transactional data or financial data of different kinds, events data, you can build models with these things that find similarly these patterns, which is what all statistical machine learning things do anyway. So from our perspective, when I look at this data, we look at kind of two types of data. One that are focused on the customer experiences, the more direct customer experiences, where customers include our associates, our employees. And the other is where you're using the data to kind of feed, like you said, decision engines. And there, on the latter, on the decision engine piece, all of the standard existing model governance and scaffolding applies. I spent a lot of time in the tech world before I came to Capital One, and there used to be this abstract exploration of fairness and AI, et cetera. Coming to the finance industry, one of the most pleasant learnings for me has been this whole scaffolding around model governance, how there are existing laws that require certain processes to be followed, how those laws have been codified into regulations, but most importantly, translated into practice in terms of model governance and the specific statistical tests that are to be done to ensure compliance with the laws. And all of that scaffolding still applies, whatever is the predictive techniques that you use, except in these cases, sometimes you have to create certain more analytical tools that can help you inspect these models in a more deeper way. And so that's why some of the uses where the risk might be higher, we want to slope into it. We want to use early low-risk explorations to kind of learn the behaviors of these models and slope into them. And then we're left with the other part, which is all of the what we like to call productivity improving. But what I'll say is focus on productivity alone is somewhat reductive, because I think what they also help us do, and we'll talk about this later maybe, is improve quality and improve the completeness of the work products people produce. So pure focus on productivity, I think, misses the biggest transformation that this will drive for us, which is improving quality and completeness.
When we're thinking about the data, the entire flow that we have, we've seen, especially in large language models as well, that the response that we're getting at a certain day may not be the response that we get in another day. So when you think about, the flow and implementation of the models that you have, how are you ultimately ensuring model performance, and what are you doing to understand it?
I think the model has to change. It's not that they on their own start changing in weird ways. It's that if your inputs change in small ways, and you don't with the older systems, I'll give you an example. If you had an old language processing system before you had generative AI, and it was very surface form, word focused, and I asked it, what is your height? And it knew how to go look up some database and give it to you. And then you go and ask it, how tall are you? It's like, I have no idea what that question is, right? And so it doesn't know, but as humans, we all know what it means. So one of the leaps here is that these things have a semantic understanding of the fact that these are both the same kind of need that the user is expressing, and they understand it. the thing is, when you use them in like kind of completion form or purely generative form, as opposed to interpretation, then small changes in the input are basically changes in the stimulus you're giving it. So what you learn to do is to bring in much more rigor and discipline around how you construct these prompts, how you expose these stimuli to these models. But also, the first deployment is really just the first step on your AI stairway to heaven, if you will, because most of the work starts after that. The other steps are the ones that are even more useful. What are your post-deployment practices? What are your observability and monitoring things? How do you record the data? How do you interact? How do you record the interaction data? How do you bring all of that back in to improve these models? It's okay to make a mistake once. It's kind of sad to keep making the same mistake again and again. And that's the principle we want to bring to life with these things.
Great. When we're thinking about innovation, and especially operational efficiency, Corinne, at Morgan Stanley, you've implemented Morgan Stanley Debrief, which is an automated note-taking tool that has the capability to automatically generate notes, like schedule appointments and follow-ups. And so when you think about that implementation over time, can you talk to us a little bit about the key challenges and barriers that you run into, but then also how it ultimately revolutionizes the day-to-day use in financial services for the advisors?
Definitely, yes. So AI at MS Debrief, just as Laurent said, is a meeting summarization tool, right? And we're not going to be the only firm. We're already not the only firm that's deploying that type of solution. Zoom has a meeting summarization, Teams does, and a whole host of others. When we thought about implementing a use case like meeting summarization at Morgan Stanley, it was really with the foundational focus and principle that one of the things we're trying to do holistically related to generative AI is improve the operational efficiency and productivity of our day-to-day employees, right? How do we add time back into people's day so that they can repurpose that time and spend it in a higher value way? Foundationally, across use cases, that's one of our consistent goals. Implementing Debrief, interestingly from a generative AI standpoint, is a relatively simple generative AI use case, right? We're doing kind of a two-step solution. First is a transcription call with Whisper. We use the OpenAI model, which is Whisper, for purposes of voice transcription. And then we're taking that transcript and we're doing the next call with GPT-4 related to the summarization output. And crafting a good meeting summary with a good prompt instruction is relatively easy to do. Back to this first point, the first prompt is not the final prompt, right? You're evaluating, you're going through your annotation process, and ultimately the prompt that goes into production is prompt 15. You continue that annotation and evaluation process, you get user feedback. So that whole journey continues, but again, Debrief was less complicated from a generative AI or technological standpoint, much more complicated from a legal risk and compliance standpoint, because we were introducing into the bank the concept of call recording, capturing consent, not only from our employees, but from external clients, thinking through what classifies as a record of the firm, right? Does an audio recording, does a transcript classify as a record of the firm, and therefore do we have an obligation to retain those documents? And if we do, what does that mean related to overall litigation risk? So those were some of kind of the big components that frankly we took better part of 1.5 years to solution, and we did that with our regulators, certainly our control partners internally, but our external regulators as well. We showed them what our final stance was related to things like transcriptions and summarizations and what needs to be retained and what doesn't before we moved into production.
Great. So when you think about enhancing that tool, is there a place where you use, for example, non-verbal sentiment analysis to ultimately provide a better customer experience in the future?
Absolutely. So, the interesting thing is right now, like I said, we are using Whisper for purposes of voice transcription. But ultimately, I don't think Whisper ends up being the solution, right? I think as we move into this multimodal function, you can use GPT-4o as an example. Now that model has the ability to see as well as hear and read, right? And so what you can see in terms of the nonverbal cues, the facial expressions, certainly what you can hear in terms of tone, sarcasm, level of voice if someone's yelling or speaking quietly, all of that now becomes part of the overall call sentiment analysis and would improve the quality of not only the summary output, but then what's kind of propagated to the financial advisor. They're the human in the loop, right? They're the human that we're enabling in order to serve their client better. What's propagated to the advisor to say, you know, based on the conversation you had with Corin last week, here are some potential next steps for you to consider. And it may not be all product related, right? It may be relationship related based on the underlying sentiment that now a multi-model function is able to evaluate and assess.
Maybe just an interesting, possibly interesting point to add to it. When we think about these things like sentiment or stuff like that, there's a particular set of ideas maybe evokes in our minds. But if you think about the conversations that we all have, the ability to respond to nonverbal cues is kind of super important to us having very efficient dialogue with each other. It's a process that's often called entrainment in human dialogue. And so if somebody's speaking really slow, you will slow down your rate of speech so that it's more comprehensible. So as you're thinking about how nonverbal cues can be used, there are things like the rate of speaking or the volume of speaking, or perhaps the accent is different. And you will notice, especially people who speak languages with multiple dialects, you will all start regressing to a particular dialect when you're speaking with each other. These are the kinds of things that this new kind of technology will kind of open up. Essentially, it allows you to meet the other party, and usually the customer, where they are, when they are there, in the way they want to be met, and in ways that are most satisfying to them. Even on the meeting summarization piece, Corin, I was thinking, like there is a summary of a meeting, and maybe there are some action items. And you have the static thing that you have today, and even a human has created it. It's awesome, it's just great. Now I want to just know, can somebody give me more context about this particular action item in that meeting that nobody captured? That kind of completeness and improvement in quality is really what we're looking at. Now that thing has to be practiced, like you said, properly, because certain things become part of the record, et cetera. But if you look at destination, that's why this thing is so exciting. Not that it's going to change it tomorrow, but the future is going to be phenomenally different.
Just to add to that point, it's also really foundational when we think about operational efficiencies in addition to personal efficiencies, right? The idea of call summarization can be extended to every call center, not just within the walls of Morgan Stanley, but well beyond. How do we effectively help a call center agent not only do their report at the end of the call, what was discussed, what boxes do I need to check, but in real time, how do we propagate to that call center agent relevant information based on the conversation they're having with that client that they're serving, right? And then that becomes a combination of not only real-time streaming, transcription, summarization, but also a RAG solution where then you're pulling the content, likely for us within the walls of our internal content to say, oh, the client just talked about a 401k, we're gonna propagate now to the call center agent relevant content related to the 401k conversation that this person is having with a call center agent. That's less within Morgan Stanley full service, but it is relevant particularly in our E-Trade business, right, where it's a more self-serve client and someone's calling the call center for that type of engagement and solution.
Prem, when you think about the success of implementing AI across an organization, what would you say were the key elements and strategic approaches that you used at Capital One to ultimately integrate AI across the business?
Okay. Maybe we can take a step back and think about the prerequisites for successful deployment of AI, right? At least at scale. I think one of those is the tech stack that you have. How modern is it? And not because you're from where you are, but Capital One is essentially a cloud-native developer. We're all in on the cloud, and so most of our development, which enforces certain modern tech stack development practices that readies you for adoption of new technologies. Second is the state of your data. How complete is your data? How much volume do you have? What is the quality of your data? What is your ability to inspect the quality of the data? What are you willing to invest in improving the quality of the data and its completeness? This all goes back to the tech stack again, because if you're trying to do all of this manually, it simply doesn't scale. So you have to have a system where things are being generated automatically, but with verifiable or accessible quality. And the third is the talent that you have that you're able to bring to bear on it. And as I was saying, because of this whole ML, machine learning, and statistical machine learning being deep in our DNA, and I have some colleagues here in the audience, like John Morgan, who I see out there, who's been here for 15 years, and we've been instrumental in developing our model governance framework, et cetera. So all of that is one part of it. The other part of it is to keep in mind, what does each phase or each kind of inflection point in this technology do for you? I think one of the noble aims of AI in my mind is to transfer particularly burdensome cognitive tasks, where the cognitive burden is very high and not suited to the human, from the human to the system. Looking up information from massive troves of data, synthesizing related information from disparate pieces all over the place, or just looking at large volumes of data and making sense of them. These are all particularly burdensome tasks. And so first you look to see, where is the cognitive burden the most? Because if you go with an immediate focus on like dollar ROI, it's not clear that you pick fundamentally transformative use cases. So where is the cognitive burden the most? Where is the customer experience likely to be the most improved? I think these are all, in my mind, fundamental levers of eventual business outcomes. But leaping over to like the most near-term business outcome, especially in an environment where all kinds of costs, in the last 20 months, the cost of inference, depending on your task, has gone down by either a factor of 100 or a factor of 1,000 for the same quality of output. In that kind of dynamism, the very notion that you can make a reasonable decision on ROI in the near term begs some disbelief, the suspension of disbelief. So you really have to focus on fundamental levels.
Okay. So we hear a lot about the big large language models that various organizations are consuming. When we work with customers in Amazon Web Services, we see that about 97% of our customers are not just using multiple models, but they pool them together to create compounding intelligence that by far exceeds what any single model can do. So, Corinne, when you think about what you do at Morgan Stanley, how do you make decisions, and what factors are you looking at when you think about open source models, third-party models, or models that you're building yourself?
So we're in the lucky position of having the only strategic partnership with OpenAI within the wealth space. And that gives us access not only to the models that are available, but also early access to new versions of the models. And so really that's where we start for almost every use case, is one of the models that we have access to already based on the strategic partnership going to be fit for the purpose of this existing use case. And so far I can say, we have reasonable and kind of consistent success with that approach. Beyond that, we've not built our own large language models. We're really looking, again, at that strategic partnership or at potential vendor solutions, and then we evaluate the buy versus build, right? What can we buy in this space versus what can we build, and what are the costs, benefits, pros and cons to both of those kind of solutions. So at a very high level, that's what we're consistently focused on. It's interesting because we've also had a lot of conversations with Sam's team about the concept of fine-tuning some of the models within, the walls of Morgan Stanley, which we actually have not done yet. And again, it's because we found a lot of success simply with prompt engineering. And I say simply because it's certainly not simple. It's very sophisticated, and some of the prompts are quite complex. But we've been able to effectively prompt the models in order to get the types of outcomes that we want and that are fit for purpose for things like not just summarization, but much more complex generative use cases like virtual assistant support and using RAG, sourcing the content, pointing the model at just our internal content in order to source the answer, finding the right embeddings and chunks and what have you in order to get to the level of completeness and accuracy with those answers that we then are comfortable putting into production.
So I want to talk a little bit about hallucinations. And when you think about AI, AI is really good with IQ tasks, right? We as humans are very good with EQ tasks. It's that gut feeling of something's wrong, right? So Prem, I want to, have you respond first. When you're thinking about hallucinations, you spoke at a previous conference and you mentioned that RAG can be used, so retrieval augmented generation can be used to help with hallucinations. We have seen quite a bit of advancements in the industries in regards to guardrails, mod evaluations, and grounding checks. Can you talk a little bit more what Capital One is doing in this space?
Yeah, happy to. But first, just to ground things, just so everybody's on the same page, a large language model is trained on massive amounts of data. So any question you ask of it, it's answering it based on what it learned from that data, right? So which means it has a static snapshot of the world. Retrieval augmented generation is a way of augmenting the knowledge in that large language model with new language that has emerged in the world since it was trained, in principle. Turns out it can also be used to constrain the answers that it generates to be from this knowledge source that you believe is highly curated, is high quality, that it's validated, it's verified, et cetera. So that's the way in which we use RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. We're happily not in the business of answering people's emotional questions or emotionally loaded questions, the world's news or opinions on certain things. We're trying to serve people who show up at our portal or on our apps with very specific tasks to be done or specific types of information that they want, a lot of which is often from our curated knowledge bases, et cetera. So that's kind of the first level of defense. The next, though, after that is, again, like I said, that's the first step, observability, monitoring, ongoing testing, constant refinement of these models. Your own knowledge bases do get updated. And because the way you do this retrieval is not directly through words, but through these numerical representations of these words, as your knowledge base gets updated, you have to update all of those intermediate components. You're making sure those are happening apace. Going back to the other kinds of models, I'll say, Laura, one of the vectors we've been on is how can we build platforms that accelerate the speed at which these models are updated with the latest data. And over time, we have actually bent that curve down to 4 or 5x improvement in the speed with which these models are trained and how much latency there is in terms of when they're put into production from when they're trained, all of that. But it goes back to data. Is your data curated, high quality? Can you inspect it? Can you validate it? And that's kind of super important in our kind of business.
Great. Corinne, as regulators consider the opportunities and harms that generative AI or LLMs can create, what would you prioritize as a regulator? And are there any specific risks that you're concerned about or approaches that you really like that we should implement?
Well, I'll steal Sam's answer. Evaluation, testing, some type of gates before models are pushed into the world is likely the right place to start. And that's actually where we've started as well, right? When we're deploying a use case, we're certainly, we're both just talking about, we're certainly not writing a prompt and just off you go, right? It's a prompt, it's an ongoing evaluation, it's a very quantifiable process to say, based on this model instruction, based on the data we've given the model access to in order to respond to this instruction, what is the output quality, right? And how do we rate that quality, again, in terms of completeness, accuracy, sentiment alignment, whatever the markers are that we've chosen for that use case specifically. And we go through that round and round process. Critical, I think, actually, to the deployment of successful use cases is the subject matter expert doing the evaluation. I cannot review the quality of a tax-related response even though I helped build our virtual assistant offering, because I am not a tax expert or specialist. I need someone in the tax department to look at the question, look at the response, and do that rating for me. So there's a very collaborative effort when you're thinking about pushing products into production, and I think, again, that's where we've started, and it's potentially where regulators start. I also think when we see regulations form, there's sometimes a desire to strive for absolute perfection right? And make that the basis before something can be used. That is what I would caution against, right? We know what we try to do is compare our current solution or the product or the use case that we're trying to push into production to where do we stand today, right? Let's use meeting summarization. It's very difficult to quantify the quality of a meeting note today, but that's what we tried to do. One, how much better is the current solution than what exists today? As long as we can prove it's substantially better, we should be allowed to use that use case. So perfection should not be the goal, right? Good should be where we're all kind of striving to get to, and our ability to prove good from a regulatory standpoint is where I think regulators should focus their time as well.
All right, we're almost at the end of the panel. So Prem, you have a minute to go to what are or is the greatest potential that you see in large language models, and really what are you most excited about?
I'll split it 30 seconds between one thing on the regulation piece and this. I think the biggest risk perhaps with generative AI is rushing in without thoughtful consideration. But the second biggest risk, which is very close, is walking away and getting. So what is the happy medium in there? And I think some of the things, I believe, at least in my interactions with regulators, I see what are the cultural aspects of your approach to generative AI? How are you thinking about the risk in there? Because this is so formative. It's not like somebody has a specific formula, I put these guardrails and this. But how are you approaching it? Are you approaching it with humility? Is there a test and learn approach? For us, for example, a huge risk mitigant is human in the loop. Even after we do all the kinds of testing that we want, everything we do today is with human in the loop. It's a worthwhile investment to make because as humans evaluate on an ongoing basis the output of these things, whether it's for software development or for agent assistance, it's all human in the loop. It's expensive, but it guarantees safety or the best way that we know how to, and we learn from it, right? Looking into the future, I kind of see this human in the loop system, right? Providing us, lighting up the pathway to greater capabilities because the humans are providing us such valuable feedback all the time. I think the future is agentic in that these things become very specialists in the different kinds of things that they do. I think the future is also about efficiency. How do we build these things to be smaller and more compact and just as performant? And there are some really exciting things happening at every layer of the stack, from the chips and the silicon, all the way up to people doing in-memory databases. I mean, there's the unbelievable revival of SQLite that's happening, if you can believe it, right? The second coming. So the things like that that I think in the future have more capability and more efficiency.
All right, so we're at the end of the panel. Thank you so much to the panelists for the great insights. You've not just showed us what we can do today with generative AI and large language models, but also what we ultimately can achieve in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you all.